In 1818, there was a family with no name hidden deep in Appalachia's mountains. And what happened to them is the darkest kept secret you've never heard of. Sarah Hayes thought she was getting worthless mountain land from her dead great aunt, just 40 acres of nothing that might help pay off her crushing student loans. But when her cheap metal detector started screaming near some old stones, she dug up something that changed everything. A child's skull, then another, then a rusted iron collar with words that made her blood freeze. Property of the Brotherhood, 1818. These weren't just old graves. This was evidence of something monstrous, something that powerful families have spent 200 years burying. But here's where it gets terrifying. When Sarah started digging deeper, people with serious money came knocking. $5 million for worthless land, anonymous death threats, her tires slashed in the middle of the night. Someone was very, very scared of what she might find, and they should be. Because hidden in a mountain cave, Sarah discovered the truth about the Purification Brotherhood, a religious cult that wasn't saving souls. They were trafficking children, hundreds of them, torn from their mothers and sold like livestock to wealthy families who wanted heirs with no inconvenient bloodlines. The mothers were told their babies died. The children who couldn't be sold, they became numbered slaves, worked until they collapsed. No names, no families, no one to remember them. But the most shocking twist, Sarah's own family helped build this nightmare. Her ancestor wasn't a victim, she was a recruiter, hunting desperate pregnant women and delivering them to systematic horror. And the families who got rich from buying and selling children, they're still here, still powerful, still killing anyone who gets too close to the truth. Sarah's great aunt tried to expose them. She died of a heart attack. 3 other researchers asked the wrong questions. Mysterious accidents, every single time. Now Sarah has found their records. She knows their names. She has proof of crimes that reach from 1818 to today. But she's running out of time, because some secrets, people will murder to protect. How many children were stolen and sold before someone finally said their names? And when the truth threatens to destroy the most powerful families in Appalachia, who will survive to tell it? Sarah's van tells her story in accumulated details that speak to anyone who's ever stretched a dollar until it's snapped. A PhD thesis gathers dust beside unpaid bills. There are red warnings creating an ominous rainbow across her dashboard. Instant coffee and granola bars have replaced real meals, and books stack where a bed should be, because research has always mattered more than comfort. This mobile home on wheels represents both her freedom and her desperation, the ability to chase genealogical leads anywhere in the country, funded by credit cards that stopped approving charges months ago. She photographs the skulls with clinical precision, each angle documented like the family history projects that barely pay her rent. The iron collar's inscription haunts every frame, property of the Brotherhood, 1818. Her trained eye recognizes the craftsmanship, the deliberate permanence of metal shaped to last centuries. This wasn't temporary restraint, this was ownership marked in iron. Her phone finally catches a signal as she drives toward town, and she dials 911 with fingers that won't stop shaking. The dispatcher's voice crackles through static, professional but distant, promising someone will come to investigate what sounds like another false alarm from someone who thinks they've discovered historical treasure. Across the valley, the Whitmore mansion crowns a manicured hill like a monument to generational wealth. 4 generations of coal money built those walls, each stone purchased with profits that few dare examine too closely. The mansion watches over the valley like a benevolent king, but Sarah's discovery has awakened something that prefers to remain sleeping. Inside the mansion's library, William Whitmore reads stock reports behind a mahogany desk, worth more than most people's annual salaries. His phone buzzes with news he's been dreading his entire life. The conversation is brief, coded in the language of family businesses that deal with problems before they become public relations disasters. It's starting again, he tells his son James, whose 3 degrees from Ivy League schools hide the same cold calculation that built the family fortune. James looks up from his laptop, understanding immediately. They've been preparing for this day their entire lives, knowing that eventually someone would dig in the right place and find what their ancestors buried. In the Hayes property? James asks, and his father's nod confirms their worst fears. She found them. After 2 centuries of successful concealment, some broke graduate student with a metal detector has unearthed the foundation of their empire. Detective Mike Torres arrives at Sarah's property with the skepticism of a man who's investigated too many false alarms. People discover old bones and immediately assume they've stumbled onto historical significance, not understanding that mountains are full of forgotten graves. But his skepticism evaporates the moment Sarah leads him to what she's uncovered. The iron collars change everything. Torres recognizes craftsmanship from another era, the kind of metalwork that speaks to systematic oppression rather than random violence. His grandmother cleaned houses for families who whispered about things that happened in the mountains. Stories passed down through generations of domestic workers who saw more than they were supposed to see, heard conversations not meant for their ears. Torres calls for backup while Sarah spreads her research across the hood of his patrol car. Maps, photocopied records, genealogy charts, the tools of her trade deployed like weapons against deliberately obscured history. She's building a timeline of absence, mapping all the families who should have existed but left no trace in official records. At the county courthouse, records clerk Martha Klein hovers nervously as Sarah demands documents spanning the crucial decade from 1815 to 1825. Martha has worked here 40 years, organizing and filing the paperwork that documents human lives in legal terms. But she's never seen anyone dig this deep into the early settlement period. The files Martha returns are disappointingly thin, and Sarah's trained eye immediately spots the deliberate gaps. 40 acres, 10 years of human habitation, and virtually no paper trail. Birth certificates missing, death certificates absent, tax records incomplete. Someone has systematically erased evidence of whoever lived on her property during those crucial years. In the mountain cemetery, Sarah walks among weathered headstones with her notebook, looking for patterns that might connect to her property. Dolores Martinez, an elderly woman tending her family's grave with hands gnarled by decades of hard work, recognizes Sarah as the one who found those bones. News travels fast in small communities, especially news this disturbing. Dolores shares stories passed down from her great-grandmother about children who went missing and families who lost babies but were told they died, when sometimes you could still hear them crying up in those mountains long after they were supposed to be buried. The stories were always dismissed as grief-induced hallucinations, but Dolores's eyes suggest she believes every word. That night, Sarah spreads her research across her van's fold-out table, laptop screen glowing with ancestry websites and historical databases. She's doing what she does best, building family trees and tracing bloodlines. But this time she's mapping absence instead of presence, documenting systematic erasure rather than celebrating family connections. When her phone rings with an unknown number, she answers, expecting a potential client. Instead, a filtered voice delivers a simple message: "Stop digging. Some secrets stay buried for good reason. Walk away while you can." The line goes dead before she can respond, leaving her staring at the phone with adrenaline flooding her system. She's hit something important, something worth threatening her over. The next morning, Torres slides into a diner booth across from Sarah, coffee already in his hands like armor against the day ahead. The Blue Moon Diner buzzes with morning conversation. Farmers discussing weather, retirees solving the world's problems, teenagers fueling up before school. But their corner feels isolated by the weight of what they're discussing. The coroner has confirmed her discovery. At least 12 children, ages ranging from newborn to maybe 10 years old, all deceased in the early 1800s. The iron collars suggest systematic oppression rather than natural death, and the organized burial pattern indicates someone treated these children as inventory rather than human beings. Sarah jolts awake to the sound of footsteps circling her van in the pre-dawn darkness. She holds her breath, watching shadows move past the windows with purposeful intent. These aren't random vandals or curious teenagers. This is surveillance, intimidation, a message delivered through fear. Car doors slam in the distance, engines start, and by the time morning comes, she finds her tires slashed and a message carved deep into the van's metal side. Last warning. The vandalism represents more than property damage. It's a promise of escalation, a clear statement that someone with resources and connections is willing to move from verbal threats to physical action. Sarah photographs the damage with the same methodical precision she uses for genealogical evidence, understanding that documentation might save her life. Torres studies the crime scene photos while Sarah paces his office like a caged animal, agitated by more than just tire replacement costs. The sheriff's department occupies a building that's seen better decades, its linoleum floors worn thin by generations of deputies investigating the same families, the same problems, the same carefully maintained silences that keep small communities functional. I ran the license plates from the security camera across the street, Torres tells her, spreading surveillance photos across his desk. Registered to a company owned by Whitmore Industries. The revelation lands between them like a stone dropped into still water, ripples expanding outward toward implications neither wants to fully acknowledge. Sarah stops pacing, pieces clicking together in her trained mind. What if they're not just trying to scare me away? What if they're protecting something specific? She's spent years helping families uncover buried genealogical secrets, and she recognizes the pattern of systematic concealment when she sees it. Like what? Torres asks, though his expression suggests he already knows the answer. His grandmother's whispered stories about mountain families and their charitable works are starting to make sense in ways that make his stomach turn. Like evidence that their family fortune was built on something monstrous, Sarah replies, the words hanging in the air like an accusation that's taken 2 centuries to voice. At the regional library, Sarah dives deeper into historical records, requesting documents that haven't been touched in decades. Librarian Janet Foster watches nervously as Sarah pulls file after file, her academic credentials opening doors that usually remain closed. But when Sarah requests the Whitmore family business records from the early 1800s, Janet's demeanor shifts from helpful to defensive. Those records are restricted, Janet explains, checking and rechecking her computer system. Family request, privacy concerns. The explanation feels rehearsed, as if Janet has given it before to other researchers who asked uncomfortable questions about local history. Sarah's genealogical training kicks in immediately. She knows how to trace family trees through public records, tax documents, marriage certificates, the paper trail that documents human lives in legal terms. The Whitmores can restrict access to some documents, but they can't erase everything without leaving evidence of the erasure itself. In the microfilm room, Sarah scrolls through digitized newspapers from the 1820s, hunting for references to mountain communities and charitable organizations. Most stories focus on politics and trade agreements, but she finds scattered references to charitable works in the mountains and families help through difficult times that read like euphemisms when viewed through the lens of her discoveries. Then she finds it, buried in a business journal from 1825. Like a confession hidden in plain sight, Eastone's mountain enterprise concluded profitably, with grateful families throughout the region benefiting from his charitable redistributions. Local benefactors, including the Whitmore concern, praised the Reverend's discreet handling of delicate family matters. Either as she can, Stone, Sarah whispers, the name feeling heavy in her mouth. She's found the architect of whatever happened on her property, and the first concrete evidence linking the Whitmores to his operations. Alone on mountain trails, Sarah follows property markers toward the heart of her inherited land, metal detector guiding her to what remains of old foundations. Stone footings emerge from decades of accumulated soil and vegetation, revealing the skeletal outline of buildings that once housed human lives and human suffering. The foundations arrange themselves in a compound pattern that speaks to her genealogist's understanding of community organization. Living quarters surround work buildings, which in turn surround the largest foundation of all, a central structure that commanded views of everything else. This wasn't just a religious community, it was designed for control, for containment, for the systematic management of human beings treated as resources rather than people. That night, Sarah creates a detailed map of the compound, cross-referencing her findings with historical surveys and property records. The pattern becomes clearer with each connection she makes: isolation from outside authority, controlled access, centralized oversight. Every architectural decision served to maximize control over residents who had no other options. Her laptop chimes with a new email from an anonymous sender, the message brief but loaded with implication. Your great-aunt knew. Ask yourself why she left you that land. Ask yourself what she expected you to find. Sarah stares at the words, understanding flooding through her like revelation. This wasn't random inheritance distributed according to legal requirements. This was intentional, purposeful. Her great-aunt had discovered something and passed the responsibility to someone she trusted to handle it properly. At the nursing home, Sarah visits Helen Carey, her great-aunt's former neighbor whose memory fades in and out like radio static. But Helen's eyes sharpen with surprising clarity when Sarah mentions the mountain property, as if the subject burns through the fog of age confusion. Eleanor found something up there, Helen explains, gripping Sarah's hand with surprising strength. Last year before she died, made her sick to her stomach, whatever she discovered. Helen's voice drops to a whisper, as if the nursing home walls might be listening. She said the devil himself had kept better books. The phrase stops Sarah's heart. Books, records, documentation. Her great-aunt had found evidence, not just graves, and had hidden it somewhere on the property for Sarah to discover. She said someone had to tell their story, Helen continues. Someone had to give them names. Following her great-aunt's footsteps, Sarah returns to the mountain forest with new purpose. The trees feel different here, older and more secretive, as if they've been keeping watch over buried secrets for generations. Ancient oaks grow in perfect circles, planted deliberately rather than naturally seeded, their arrangement speaking to human intention and long-term planning. Her metal detector goes silent in this part of the forest, but her instincts lead her to a massive oak with bark scarred by old carvings. She finds the hollow at its base, hidden behind a carefully placed stone that her great-aunt must have marked for her discovery. Inside the hollow, wrapped in oilcloth that's kept it dry for decades, Sarah finds a leather-bound journal. The pages are yellow with age but still readable, filled with careful handwriting that speaks across 2 centuries with devastating clarity. The first entry stops her heart. My name is Mary. I am 16 years old. I am not a sinner, no matter what they told me. I am not property, no matter what he says. If someone finds this, please remember our names. Sarah sits across from William and James Whitmore in their mansion's drawing room, surrounded by wealth that reeks of old money and older secrets. Persian rugs worth small fortunes cover floors that have witnessed generations of family conversations about maintaining power and suppressing inconvenient truths. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors watch from gilded frames, their painted eyes holding the same cold calculation she recognizes in their living descendant. William Whitmore carries himself with the practiced authority of someone who's never been told no by anyone who mattered. At 65, he represents 4 generations of accumulated power. Coal money invested and reinvested until it became political influence, social standing, and the kind of respectability that makes people forget to ask uncomfortable questions about historical foundations. Ms. Hayes, William begins with the measured tone of a man used to buying solutions to problems. I understand you've made some interesting discoveries on your property. His word choice is careful, clinical, discoveries rather than evidence, interesting rather than horrifying. Sarah places Mary's journal on the coffee table between them, watching both men's eyes fix on it immediately with recognition that confirms her suspicions. Children's graves, and evidence of organized trafficking in the 1800s. She doesn't soften her language or dress it in euphemisms. These men understand exactly what she's found. James Whitmore, 35 and educated at the finest institutions money can buy, leans forward with his father's sane, calculating expression. Ancient history, tragic certainly, but hardly relevant to anyone alive today. His dismissal comes too quickly, too practiced. as if he's rehearsed this conversation many times in preparation for this exact moment. Mary thought it was relevant. Sarah replies, her hand resting protectively on the journal. She documented everything: names, dates, payments made to local families who helped cover up systematic child trafficking. The words hang in the air like an indictment that's been waiting 2 centuries to be read aloud. William exchanges a meaningful glance with his son before asking the question that reveals their true priorities. What do you want? The assumption underlying his query speaks to a worldview where everything and everyone has a price, where problems can be resolved through financial negotiation rather than moral reckoning. I want the truth, Sarah answers simply. I want those children to have names instead of numbers. I want their families to know what happened to them. Her goals sound almost naive in this room full of accumulated power, but the simplicity of her demand makes it more dangerous than any financial threat. And in exchange, James prompts, still thinking in terms of transaction and mutual benefit rather than justice and historical accuracy. The Whitmore family has spent generations converting moral obligations into business arrangements, and they can't conceive of someone who operates outside that framework. Nothing. I'm not looking for money. Sarah's response lands like a bomb in their carefully controlled environment. This is worse than blackmail, worse than extortion. This is someone who can't be bought, can't be negotiated with, can't be converted into a manageable business expense. William recovers first, switching tactics to appeal to community loyalty and family reputation. Miss Hayes, you're a genealogist. You understand how family reputations work, how the sins of the past can destroy innocent present-day lives. He gestures toward the portraits on the walls, ancestral faces that watch over generations of carefully managed public image. Innocent. Sarah's single word carries enough skepticism to challenge 4 generations of charitable donations and community leadership. She's studied these portraits while waiting, recognizing something familiar in their painted eyes. The same cold calculation, the same willingness to treat human beings as resources to be managed. The conversation continues with offers that escalate from $1 million to $2 to $5 million for her property, each increase revealing the depth of their desperation. $5 million represents more than Sarah will earn in her lifetime, enough to solve every financial problem she's ever had and guarantee security she's never known. But some things, she tells them, aren't for sale. Walking to her van after rejecting their final offer, Sarah feels their eyes on her back like physical weight. The $5 million offer confirms everything she suspected. This goes far beyond historical curiosity or academic research. That much money means they're terrified of what she might uncover, desperate enough to gamble their entire fortune on making her disappear. Her van starts with its usual reluctant grumble, and she notices the black SUV following at a discreet distance as she drives away. The surveillance is professional but obvious, designed to intimidate as much as monitor. They want her to know she's being watched, want her to feel the weight of their attention every time she steps outside. Doris reads Mary's journal in his office with the focused intensity of a detective working a fresh homicide case. Each page makes his expression grimmer as the scope of the trafficking operation becomes clear. Hundreds of children over a decade, systematic separation of mothers from babies, meticulous record-keeping that treated human lives like livestock inventory. This is evidence of systematic human trafficking, Torres says, his voice tight with controlled anger. Children as young as newborns sold to wealthy families who wanted heirs with no inconvenient bloodlines. The historical nature of the crimes doesn't diminish their impact. If anything, the passage of time makes the systematic nature of the abuse more horrifying. Sarah tells him about the Whitmore meeting and their $5 million offer, watching Torres's expression shift from professional interest to personal outrage. That's more than our entire department budget for 5 years, he observes, which means they're scared, really scared. Mary's journal reveals the operational details of Reverend Stone's enterprise with devastating clarity. The Purification Brotherhood presented itself as a charitable organization helping fallen women find redemption through hard work and religious instruction. In reality, It was a sophisticated trafficking operation that exploited society's most vulnerable members, pregnant women rejected by their families, desperate enough to accept any shelter from social condemnation. The journal documents how Stone separated mothers from their children immediately after birth, telling them the babies had died, while secretly selling healthy infants to wealthy families throughout the region. Children who couldn't be sold became unpaid laborers, identified by numbers rather than names, worked until they died from exhaustion, malnutrition, or accidents that were never investigated by outside authorities. Sarah reads aloud from Mary's careful documentation. He keeps records in the cave. Every child sold, every family paid, every official who looks the other way. He says it's God's work, but I know what it really is. Evil dressed in scripture and justified by profit. The reference to cave records sends both Sarah and Torres back to her property with new purpose. If Mary's journal survived 2 centuries hidden in a tree hollow, Stone's operational records might still exist in whatever cave system she referenced. Those documents would provide names, dates, payment records, evidence that could connect historical crimes to present-day cover-ups. Sarah's phone buzzes with a text message that makes her blood run cold. "We know you found it. Time to make a deal." The message comes from an unknown number, but the timing makes the source obvious. The Whitmores have moved from surveillance to direct contact, abandoning any pretense of coincidence or plausible deniability. The escalation frightens Sarah more than she's willing to admit. These people have resources, connections, and a demonstrated willingness to use intimidation to protect their secrets. But Mary's journal has personalized the historical crimes in ways that make retreat impossible. Every numbered child in those graves had a name, a story, a mother who grieved their disappearance. Torres insists on providing official protection, but Sarah knows his authority extends only as far as local politics allow. If the Whitmores control enough influence to restrict historical records and monitor her movements, they probably have connections within law enforcement that could neutralize any protection Torres might offer. That night, Sarah parks her van in the most public location she can find, a 24-hour truck stop with security cameras and constant foot traffic. But even surrounded by witnesses and artificial light, she feels exposed and vulnerable. Someone with enough money to offer $5 million for worthless mountain property has the resources to reach her anywhere, anytime they choose. She calls her only living relative, a cousin in California who barely remembers her name, just to hear a familiar voice and establish that someone outside this mountain community knows where she is and what she's investigating. The conversation is brief and awkward, but it creates a paper trail that might matter if she disappeared. Sleep comes in fragments, interrupted by every truck engine, every slamming door, every footstep that might herald another escalation in the Whitmores' campaign of intimidation. Sarah has crossed a line she can't uncross, committed herself to a truth that powerful people will kill to suppress. The only way forward is deeper into the mountain, deeper into the records that Stone left behind, deeper into a conspiracy that survived 4 generations of careful management. Sarah returns to her property at dawn with Torres and a borrowed metal detector that's more sophisticated than her pawnshop model. The cave system Mary referenced in her journal has to be somewhere in the compound area, probably accessible from the main building whose foundation commands the central position. Stone would have wanted his records close but secure, protected from weather and casual discovery. The metal detector leads them to an area behind the largest foundation where the ground feels different, less solid, as if there's empty space beneath. Torres helps Sarah clear away decades of accumulated debris and vegetation, revealing a stone-lined entrance that's been deliberately concealed. The opening is narrow, designed for secrecy rather than convenience, just wide enough for a single person to descend. Sarah volunteers to go first, her smaller frame better suited for the confined space. The cave system extends deeper than expected, carved from natural limestone and reinforced with hand-laid stonework that speaks to long-term planning and significant investment. Someone spent considerable time and money creating this hidden archive. Her flashlight illuminates shelves carved into the cave walls, still holding wooden boxes that have survived 2 centuries in the stable underground environment. The first box she opens contains exactly what Mary's journal promised: meticulous records documenting Stone's trafficking operation with the systematic precision of a successful business enterprise. Ledger books list children by number rather than name, recording ages, physical descriptions, prices paid, and buyer information with clinical detachment. Birth dates, death dates, and transaction dates reduce human lives to accounting entries. Sarah photographs every page with her phone, understanding that these documents represent legal evidence of crimes that echo through generations. But it's the correspondence files that reveal the true scope of the conspiracy. Letters from wealthy families throughout the region requesting specific types of children: healthy boys for farm work, infant girls for couples who needed heirs, older children already trained in domestic duties. The letters discuss human beings like livestock, negotiating prices and delivery dates with casual cruelty that takes Sarah's breath away. Most damaging are the payment records linking prominent local families to Stone's operation. The Whitmores appear repeatedly as major financial contributors. But they're not alone. Judges, politicians, business owners, religious leaders, the entire power structure of early Appalachian society participated in or profited from systematic child trafficking. Torres receives the photographs Sarah sends from the cave with growing amazement and horror. "This is enough evidence to rewrite regional history," he tells her when she emerges hours later, dirty and emotionally drained. These aren't just random crimes. This was an organized conspiracy involving the most powerful families in the area. But Sarah's discovery triggers immediate retaliation from forces that have spent generations protecting these secrets. Her van is impounded on fabricated charges of parking violations and unpaid fines that mysteriously appear in the computer system overnight. The motel where she's staying receives anonymous complaints about disturbing other guests, resulting in her eviction despite Torres's protests. More troubling are the character assassination attempts that follow. Anonymous social media posts paint Sarah as a disturbed graduate student who's fabricating historical discoveries to gain attention and financial support for her failed academic career. Fake genealogical clients post negative reviews claiming she invented family connections and charged for research she never conducted. The campaign is sophisticated and well-funded, designed to destroy Sarah's credibility before she can present her evidence to outside authorities. Someone with significant resources and media connections is working systematically to discredit her personally and professionally, making any future testimony appear unreliable. James Whitmore visits Torres's office with an attorney and a complaint filed with the state police alleging that local law enforcement is harassing his family based on fabricated historical documents. The legal pressure forces Torres's supervisor to restrict his involvement in Sarah's investigation, effectively isolating her from official support. "They're using the system against us," Torres tells Sarah during a clandestine meeting at a truck stop outside town. "My supervisor got calls from the state capitol and the county prosecutor. Someone with serious political connections wants this investigation stopped." Sarah realizes she's fighting more than just the Whitmore family. She's challenging a conspiracy that extends through multiple generations and involves current political and business leaders who have as much to lose as the original perpetrators. The trafficking operation ended in the 1820s, but the cover-up has continued for 2 centuries, adapting to new circumstances while maintaining the same basic objective: protecting powerful families from historical accountability. The isolation campaign intensifies when Sarah discovers her academic credentials are being questioned by the university where she earned her degree. Anonymous complaints allege that her dissertation contained fabricated genealogical research, triggering an academic investigation that could result in her PhD being revoked. The attack strikes at the foundation of her professional identity and credibility. Local businesses begin refusing Sarah's business. Gas stations claim their pumps are broken. Restaurants insist they're fully booked. Mechanics refuse to work on her van. The economic pressure is subtle, but comprehensive, designed to make her continued presence in the area financially impossible. But the campaign backfires when some community members recognize the systematic nature of the attacks and begin questioning what Sarah has discovered that warrants such extreme retaliation. Dolores Martinez, the elderly woman from the cemetery, approaches Sarah with stories from other families who've suspected for generations that their ancestors' official stories didn't match whispered family memories. My grandmother always said her great-aunt didn't die in childhood like the records claimed, Dolores explains. She said the family gave her away to strangers because they couldn't afford to feed her, but they told everyone she died to avoid shame. Similar stories emerge from other longtime residents whose family oral histories contradict official records. Children who supposedly died in infancy but were seen years later with different families. Pregnant women who disappeared for months and returned claiming their babies had died, but neighbors suspected different explanations. Sarah realizes she's not just investigating historical crimes. She's uncovering systematic falsification of public records that affected dozens of families over multiple decades. The trafficking operation required extensive official cooperation to maintain the fiction that hundreds of children had died when they were actually being sold. The pattern suggests corruption that extended beyond individual crimes to institutional cover-up, involving county officials, religious authorities, and judicial systems that were supposed to protect vulnerable populations. Stone couldn't have operated at this scale without systematic cooperation from people whose job was preventing exactly these types of abuses. Torres conducts his own investigation into the historical records, focusing on official documents that should exist but are mysteriously absent from county files. Birth certificates, death certificates, property transfers, tax records. Entire categories of documentation that would normally document community life simply don't exist for the crucial period when Stone's operation was most active. Someone cleaned house, Torres concludes. And they did it systematically, removing not just individual documents, but entire record series that might have contained evidence. The scope of the historical cover-up suggests resources and authority that exceeded Stone's personal capabilities. Sarah's phone rings with an unknown caller who doesn't bother disguising his voice this time. "Miss Hayes, you're making this more difficult than necessary. We're prepared to increase our offer to $10 million for your complete cooperation and permanent silence." "Sylvia's not interested," Sarah replies, but the caller continues without acknowledging her response. "Alternatively, you should consider what happened to your great-aunt. Eleanor's death was listed as natural causes, but mountain accidents can happen to anyone who's not careful about where they step." The line goes dead, leaving Sarah staring at her phone with the understanding that the stakes have escalated from financial pressure to physical threats. Someone is willing to commit murder to protect secrets that are 2 centuries old, suggesting that the consequences of exposure extend far beyond historical embarrassment. That night, Sarah doesn't return to her van or attempt to find another motel room. Instead, she hides in the cave system with Stone's records, understanding that the mountain itself offers more protection than any building or law enforcement agency. The irony isn't lost on her. She's seeking safety in the same place where Stone once planned systematic atrocities against children. Surrounded by evidence of historical crimes and contemporary cover-ups, Sarah finally understands the true scope of what she's uncovered. This isn't just about child trafficking in the early 1800s. It's about power, corruption, and systematic oppression that has continued for generations, adapting its methods while maintaining the same basic structure that treats some human beings as resources for others to exploit. Sarah discovers the truth about her inheritance while comparing her great-aunt's genealogical research with Stone's records in the cave. The revelation hits her like a physical blow when she finds her own family name in the trafficking documents, not as victims but as participants. Her great-great-great-grandmother, Elizabeth Hayes, appears repeatedly in Stone's correspondence as a procurement agent who identified pregnant women in neighboring communities and convinced them to join the Brotherhood. Elizabeth received payment for each woman she brought to Stone's compound, earning substantial commissions that helped establish her family's financial foundation. The documents reveal that Elizabeth Hayes specialized in targeting the most vulnerable women, those rejected by their families, facing homelessness, desperate enough to accept any promise of shelter and support. She used her reputation as a midwife and healer to gain these women's trust, then delivered them to Stone's systematic exploitation. Most devastating is the discovery that Mary, whose journal had personalized the historical crimes and motivated Sarah's investigation, was recruited by Elizabeth Hayes. Mary's first journal entry, which Sarah had read as evidence of innocence and victimization, takes on new meaning. "The woman who brought me here seemed so kind. She said other girls had been helped." Sarah realizes her inheritance wasn't random generosity or even intentional truth-seeking by her great aunt. It was guilt money, passed down through generations of a family that had profited from systematic child trafficking. Her great aunt had discovered their family's true history and left Sarah the property as a form of inherited responsibility. A demand that she make amends for crimes committed by their shared ancestors. The revelation explains why the Whitmores had been so desperate to buy her property. They weren't just protecting their own family's reputation. They were protecting everyone who had participated in or profited from Stone's operation. Sarah's family name appears in the records alongside dozens of other local families who had provided services, concealment, or financial support for the trafficking ring. But the deepest shock comes from discovering that her great-aunt Eleanor hadn't just found Stone's records. She had tried to expose them. The Whitmores' threat about Eleanor's accidental death wasn't empty intimidation. Eleanor Hayes had contacted historians, journalists, and law enforcement agencies in her final months, trying to bring public attention to the historical crimes and contemporary cover-up. Eleanor's attempts at exposure had triggered the same systematic retaliation that Sarah was experiencing, but Eleanor had lacked Sarah's research skills and technological resources. The Whitmores and their allies had successfully discredited and silenced Eleanor, then arranged her death to look like a natural heart attack brought on by the stress of her false accusations and genealogical fantasies. Sarah finds Eleanor's hidden files in the cave, documenting not just the historical crimes but the contemporary conspiracy to suppress them. Eleanor had identified dozens of current-day descendants of families who participated in Stone's operation, including politicians, judges, business leaders, and religious authorities who were actively working to prevent historical accountability. The files revealed that the Whitmores had been systematically buying properties throughout the region that might contain evidence of Stone's operation, then either destroying potential archaeological sites or restricting access through legal mechanisms. Sarah's inheritance had disrupted decades of careful evidence suppression. Most chilling is Eleanor's documentation of other researchers and family historians who had stumbled onto pieces of the trafficking story over the years. Each had experienced systematic harassment, professional destruction, and in some cases mysterious accidents or health crises that ended their investigations. Eleanor had been the latest in a series of people who died after getting too close to the truth. Sarah realizes she's not just fighting to expose historical crimes. She's continuing a battle that has claimed multiple lives over several decades. The Whitmores and their allies have killed repeatedly to protect their secrets, using their wealth and connections to ensure that each death appears natural or accidental. The revelation transforms Sarah's motivation from academic curiosity to personal survival. She's not investigating abstract historical injustice, she's documenting a continuing criminal conspiracy that reaches from the 1800s into the present day. The same families who profited from child trafficking 2 centuries ago are still using violence and corruption to protect their power and reputation. But the discovery also provides Sarah with leverage she hadn't possessed before. Eleanor's files contain evidence of contemporary crimes, bribery, evidence tampering, witness intimidation, and potentially murder that fall within current statutes of limitations. The historical trafficking might be beyond legal reach, but the cover-up involves ongoing criminal activity. Sarah photographs Eleanor's contemporary files with the same methodical precision she had used for Stone's historical records. Financial records showing payments to corrupt officials, communication logs documenting systematic harassment campaigns, and medical records suggesting suspicious circumstances around several natural deaths of potential witnesses. The evidence reveals that Sarah's investigation has forced the conspiracy into dangerous exposure. Previous researchers had worked alone and been easily isolated and discredited. But Sarah's partnership with Torres, her academic credentials, and her systematic documentation of evidence have created a more serious threat to the conspiracy's continued success. Understanding floods through Sarah as she realizes why the Whitmores had escalated to direct threats so quickly. They're not just protecting historical reputation, they're preventing exposure of ongoing criminal activity that could result in contemporary prosecutions for corruption, evidence tampering, and potentially murder. The plot twist reframes everything Sarah thought she understood about her investigation. She's not just uncovering historical injustice, she's infiltrating an active criminal conspiracy that has maintained power through systematic violence for generations. The stakes aren't just academic or moral, they're literally life and death, with multiple precedents showing what happens to people who get too close to the truth. Sarah's phone shows 17 missed calls from Torres, but she doesn't dare leave the cave to return them. The Whitmores know she's found something that changes the game, and they're probably mobilizing resources to ensure she doesn't live long enough to share it with outside authorities. Sarah spends the night in Stone's cave, reviewing Eleanor's files and planning her next moves with the methodical precision of someone who understands that one mistake will cost her life. The evidence surrounding her represents more than historical documentation. It's a loaded weapon that multiple people have died trying to fire. She needs to ensure it reaches the right targets before the Whitmores can silence her permanently. Her phone finally gets enough signal to receive Torres's increasingly frantic messages. His last text makes her blood run cold. "They've got a warrant for your arrest. Evidence tampering. Get out now." The speed of the legal maneuvering confirms that the Whitmores have extensive connections within the judicial system, able to weaponize official authority against anyone who threatens their interests. Sarah creates multiple copies of the most damaging evidence, uploading photographs to cloud storage accounts, emailing files to herself at different addresses, and preparing physical copies for distribution to multiple recipients. Her academic training in archival preservation serves her well. She understands redundancy, security, and the importance of ensuring that evidence survives, even if the researcher doesn't. But she also understands that evidence alone isn't enough. Previous researchers had gathered proof, only to be discredited or eliminated before they could present it effectively. Sarah needs more than documentation. She needs credible witnesses, official support, and media attention that can't be easily suppressed or dismissed. Torres texts her coordinates for a meeting location, abandoned mining site 20 miles from town where they can talk without surveillance. Sarah leaves the cave system reluctantly, understanding that her temporary sanctuary is also a potential trap. The Whitmores know she's been accessing Stone's records, and they're probably monitoring all approaches to her property. The drive to meet Torres takes her through mountain roads that feel increasingly isolated and dangerous. Every car in her rearview mirror could be surveillance, every curve in the road a potential ambush site. Sarah has spent her adult life researching how people lived and died centuries ago, never imagining she would face the same life or death calculations as her historical subjects. At the meeting site, Torres arrives with news that confirms Sarah's worst fears. "They've got half the county looking for you on charges that are obviously fabricated, but my supervisor is treating it like a legitimate warrant, which means someone higher up the chain is involved in the cover-up." Sarah shows Torres Eleanor's files documenting the contemporary conspiracy, watching his expression shift from professional concern to personal outrage. "Your great-aunt identified at least 3 suspicious deaths over the past decade, all people who had been researching local family histories and asking questions about the early settlement period. The evidence reveals a pattern of systematic elimination that extends far beyond Eleanor's death. Graduate students, amateur historians, genealogists working on family trees. Anyone who stumbled onto pieces of the trafficking story had experienced harassment, professional destruction, and in several cases, fatal accidents or sudden illnesses that ended their research. They're not just covering up historical crimes, Torres realizes. They're committing new crimes to protect old ones. That brings this under current jurisdiction and gives us legal authority to investigate. But his authority extends only as far as local politics allow, and the Whitmores' influence reaches deep into state-level law enforcement and judicial system. Sarah makes the hardest decision of her life, understanding that survival requires abandoning everything she's worked for and trusted in. I'm going to send copies of everything to major news outlets, federal authorities, and academic institutions simultaneously. Create too many targets for them to silence all of them. Torres nods grimly. But first we need to get you out of this county alive. They've got resources and connections that we can't match, but they're also constrained by the need to maintain their public image. If they kill you in a way that draws attention, it defeats the purpose of the cover-up. They plan Sarah's escape route carefully, using back roads and timing that avoid checkpoints and surveillance. Torres will provide distraction by officially pursuing the fabricated charges against Sarah, giving her time to reach outside authorities before the Whitmores realize she's beyond their immediate reach. But Sarah refuses to simply run. These children deserved better than being treated as inventory. Mary deserved better than dying in that compound while her traffickers got rich. My great-aunt deserved better than being murdered for trying to tell the truth. I'm not walking away. The conversation reveals the depth of Sarah's transformation from academic researcher to determined activist. The woman who inherited worthless mountain property to pay off student loans has become someone willing to risk everything for justice. That's 2 centuries overdue. The personal stakes have merged with historical accountability in ways that make retreat impossible. Torres understands her motivation, but fears for her survival. The Whitmores have killed multiple people to protect these secrets. They're not going to hesitate to kill you, no matter how much evidence you've gathered or how many copies you've made. Sarah reveals her final strategy, born from hours of planning in Stone's cave surrounded by evidence of historical atrocities. I'm not just going to expose the trafficking and cover-up. I'm going to force them to confront it publicly, in a way that makes denial impossible and violence counterproductive. Her plan involves returning to her property openly, officially, with enough witnesses and media attention to make her disappearance a major story, rather than an easily dismissed accident. Sarah will use the Whitmores' need for public respectability against them, forcing them to either allow exposure of their historical crimes or commit contemporary crimes in full view of outside observers. The strategy is risky, but psychologically sound. The Whitmores have spent generations building their reputation as community leaders and philanthropists. Their power depends on public perception that can't survive exposure of systematic child trafficking and murder. They're trapped between historical accountability and contemporary justice, with no option that doesn't threaten their essential interests. Torres agrees to help coordinate the public confrontation, using his official position to ensure proper documentation and witness protection. If we're going to do this, we need to do it right. No ambiguity, no deniability, no opportunity for them to spin the narrative in their favor. Sarah spends her final hours of preparation writing letters to family members she barely knows, explaining her discoveries and motivations in case she doesn't survive to present them personally. The letters serve as insurance policies and final statements, ensuring that someone outside the immediate conspiracy understands what she found and why she chose to risk everything exposing it. But the letters also represent personal reconciliation with her family's historical complicity in the trafficking operation. Sarah acknowledges her ancestors' crimes while taking responsibility for making amends through her own actions. The guilt money that had supported her family for generations would finally be converted into justice for its victims. The irony isn't lost on Sarah that she's following the same path as her great-aunt Eleanor, making the same choice to prioritize truth over safety. But Sarah has advantages Eleanor lacked: better technology for preserving evidence, stronger connections to outside authorities, and, most importantly, a partner in Torres who understands the local power structure and can provide official support. As dawn breaks over the mountains that have kept their secrets for 2 centuries, Sarah prepares to return to her property for what she understands may be the final confrontation with forces that have killed repeatedly to maintain their power. The scared graduate student who inherited worthless land has become someone willing to die for justice that transcends personal survival. The transformation is complete, and the final battle is about to begin. Sarah drives openly to her property at midday, followed by Torres in his official vehicle, a news crew from the regional television station, and representatives from the state attorney general's office, who Torres had contacted despite local political pressure. The convoy represents exactly what the Whitmores had spent generations preventing: outside scrutiny of their carefully protected secrets, official investigation of their historical crimes, and public attention that can't be easily suppressed or redirected. The Whitmores arrived within minutes, William and James accompanied by their attorney and several men whose roles are deliberately ambiguous. The confrontation takes place in full view of cameras and official witnesses, forcing both sides to maintain facades of civility while engaging in a battle for historical truth and contemporary justice. Mrs. Hayes, William begins with the controlled tone of a man who's discovered that money and influence have limits when faced with sufficient evidence and public attention. I think there's been a misunderstanding about your research and our family's historical connections. Sarah doesn't reply immediately. Instead, she leads the assembled witnesses to the excavation site, where the children's remains have been carefully documented and preserved according to archaeological standards. The graves speak for themselves: systematic burial patterns, iron restraints, evidence of systematic exploitation that can't be dismissed or recontextualized through euphemism. These children weren't misunderstood, Sarah says, her voice carrying clearly to the cameras and recording devices. They were property, bought and sold by families who treated human beings as inventory. She holds up photocopies of Stone's ledgers, the handwritten records that document prices paid and services rendered with clinical precision. James Whitmore steps forward, his legal training evident in his careful word choices. Historical documents can be misinterpreted, especially when taken out of context. Our family has always been committed to charitable works and community support. Sarah produces the correspondence files that explicitly detail the Whitmores' financial contributions to Stone's trafficking operation. Letters requesting specific types of children, payment receipts for charitable donations, and progress reports on the redistribution of children to families throughout the region. The documentation is comprehensive and damning, impossible to recontextualize as legitimate charity. Your ancestors weren't supporting charity, Sarah states flatly. They were investing in systematic child trafficking. And your family has spent the past 2 centuries covering it up through bribery, intimidation, and murder. The accusation of contemporary crimes shifts the confrontation from historical accountability to present-day criminal liability. Sarah produces Eleanor's files documenting the ongoing conspiracy, evidence of payments to officials, records of harassment campaigns, and medical documentations suggesting suspicious circumstances around several natural deaths. William Whitmore's composure cracks for the first time. Those are serious accusations that require serious proof. Anyone can fabricate documents or create conspiracy theories based on circumstantial evidence. Sarah had anticipated this response. She leads the group to Stone's cave system, now properly illuminated and documented by Torres and the state investigators. The underground archive represents irrefutable proof, physical evidence that has survived 2 centuries in controlled conditions, cross-referenced with official records that confirm its authenticity. The cave contains not just Stone's original documents, but evidence of the contemporary cover-up attempts. Modern tools found in the cave system, recent disturbances to the document storage areas, and security equipment installed to monitor access to the historical records. The Whitmores had been managing this site for decades, controlling access and removing potentially damaging evidence. More damaging is the discovery of Eleanor Hayes's research files hidden in a secondary chamber of the cave system. Eleanor had been more thorough than anyone suspected, documenting decades of suspicious deaths and identifying the systematic nature of the ongoing conspiracy. Her files provide the missing connections between historical crimes and contemporary cover-up attempts. Torres presents the official law enforcement perspective, reading formal charges that have been filed with state authorities based on Sarah's evidence. Conspiracy to obstruct justice, evidence tampering, witness intimidation, and potential homicide in the deaths of Eleanor Hayes and at least 3 other researchers over the past decade. The charges shift the confrontation from historical debate to immediate legal jeopardy. The Whitmores face not just exposure of ancestral crimes, but prosecution for contemporary felonies that carry significant prison sentences. Their carefully constructed public image crumbles in real time as television cameras based on overwhelming evidence. James Whitmore makes a final attempt to regain control of the narrative. Even if these historical documents are authentic, they represent crimes committed by people who died generations ago. Our family has spent decades making amends through charitable contributions and community service. Sarah has prepared for this argument as well. She produces financial records showing that the Whitmore family's charitable donations, while substantial in absolute terms, represent a tiny fraction of the wealth accumulated through their ancestors' participation in child trafficking. More importantly, their charity has been strategically directed toward institutions and causes that enhance their public image while avoiding any acknowledgement of historical accountability. The confrontation reaches its climax when Sarah presents the most damaging evidence of all: audio recordings that Eleanor had made before her death, documenting explicit threats from Whitmore family members and their associates. Eleanor had been more prepared than anyone realized, creating an insurance policy that survived her murder and provided proof of contemporary criminal activity. The recordings capture William Whitmore's voice clearly, threatening Eleanor with consequences for her interference and false accusations. The audio evidence establishes clear intent and demonstrates that the Whitmores were directly involved in silencing previous researchers through threats and violence. With overwhelming evidence presented in full public view, the Whitmores' attorney advises them to remain silent while state investigators secure the scene and begin formal criminal proceedings. The dynasty that had controlled local politics and business for 4 generations faces immediate criminal charges and inevitable historical accountability. Sarah watches as investigators document the evidence she's gathered, understanding that the confrontation represents more than personal vindication or historical justice. The children buried on her property finally have names, families throughout the region finally understand what happened to their missing ancestors, and a systematic conspiracy that had survived for 2 centuries has been exposed and dismantled. Torres coordinates with state authorities to ensure that all evidence is properly preserved and that the ongoing investigation receives resources and attention that local political pressure can't suppress. The involvement of outside agencies and media attention makes it impossible for the conspiracy to continue its historical pattern of intimidation and cover-up. But the most important moment comes when Sarah kneels beside the graves that had started her investigation, reading the names she's finally been able to match to the numbered remains. Mary's journal had provided some identifications, Stone's records had provided others, and genealogical research had connected the historical victims to present-day family members who could finally understand their ancestors' fates. The children have names now. Their families know what happened to them. The truth that powerful people spent 2 centuries burying has finally emerged into daylight, where it can no longer be suppressed or denied. Justice, delayed by 2 centuries, has finally been served. 6 months later, Sarah stands in the memorial garden that has replaced the unmarked graves on her property. Local families whose ancestors had been victims of Stone's trafficking operation have contributed resources and labor to create a place of remembrance and healing. Each child has a headstone with their recovered name, birth date, and a simple inscription, "Finally remembered." The Whitmore family has been systematically prosecuted for their contemporary crimes, while facing civil lawsuits from descendant families seeking damages for historical injustices. William Whitmore died of a heart attack while awaiting trial, and James has accepted a plea bargain that includes substantial financial restitution and cooperation with ongoing historical investigations. Sarah hasn't become wealthy from her discoveries, despite multiple book deal offers and documentary proposals. Instead, she's established a genealogical research center focused on recovering the identities of historical trafficking victims throughout Appalachia. Her inheritance has been converted from guilt money to a foundation for justice and historical accountability. Torres has been promoted within the state law enforcement system, his successful investigation of a multi-generational conspiracy leading to broader efforts to investigate cold cases involving systematic corruption. He visits the memorial garden regularly, understanding that his role in exposing the truth represents the best aspects of law enforcement service. The cave system where Stone kept his records has been converted to a research facility and museum, preserving the evidence that documented systematic human trafficking while educating visitors about historical injustices that were previously hidden from public knowledge. Mary's journal holds a place of honor, her courage in documenting atrocities, providing inspiration for contemporary efforts to protect vulnerable populations. But the most meaningful change is in the community itself. Families who had whispered stories about missing ancestors for generations finally have official acknowledgement of their losses and trauma. The memorial garden serves as a gathering place for descendants who can finally grieve openly and remember their ancestors with dignity rather than shame. Sarah lives in a small house near the memorial, her student loans paid off through a combination of state rewards for exposing official corruption and modest income from her genealogical research center. Her van has been retired, replaced by the kind of settled life she never thought she wanted but has learned to appreciate. She receives regular visitors, historians documenting the trafficking operation, family members tracing their ancestry to recovered victims, and other researchers investigating similar patterns of historical exploitation and cover-up throughout the region. Sarah's work has inspired broader efforts to uncover systematic injustices that powerful families have spent generations concealing. The memorial garden grows each year as more victims are identified and more families learn the truth about their missing ancestors. What began as Sarah's desperate attempt to solve her financial problems has become a lasting legacy of justice for people who were silenced for 2 centuries. Standing among the named graves of children who were finally recognized as human beings rather than property, Sarah understands that some inheritances carry responsibilities that transcend personal benefit. Her great-aunt's legacy has been fulfilled, the children have names, their stories have been told, and the truth has emerged from mountain soil where it was buried by people who thought wealth and power could suppress justice forever. Some secrets were meant to be uncovered. Some debts demand payment across centuries. Some truths are worth dying for, and finally, worth living for.